Okay? Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
For coming out. Oh, by the way, there'll be books for sale.
Thanks for having us here today, Rich. Well, in 1970, my late grandmother, Aldrich, she had gathered notes over a long period of time for a history of our company. In 1870, I believe it was the East Oregonian turned 100. That was the hallmark. And so we hired a man named Gordon McNabb, who was a retired Associated Press editor out of Portland. And he wrote the book. And it's very Umatilla County centered. It also is in 1970 before we acquired papers such as The Chieftain, or The Eagle, or Hermiston, or the Gallup Press in Salem. So a lot's changed since 1970. And also this time around we wanted a historian to write the book. Nothing against former journalists. There's a few of you in the room, and I'm one myself, so we're all good people. But historians cover things with a slightly different set of skills, I'll say. And so we turned to Bill Willingham, who went to high school with me in Pendleton, 2 classes ahead of me. We had the same history teacher, Phil Farley, a remarkable teacher, and Bill took it all the way to becoming a historian. And we retained Bill, I'd say 4 years ago. He's done 4 years worth of research, and there are at least, I won't say surprises, there are at least 2 elements of aha in this book for me that I kind of knew about, but I didn't really know the whole story. So he's done a great job of bringing this all together, and he, as you may know, was author of the book called Starting Over, which is about the resurrection or birth, however you put it, of Long Creek. And so his family stems from this part of the world. And so I give you Bill Willingham.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Steve mentioned, I grew up in Pendleton in the 50s and 60s, and every summer we would come over to Wallowa Lake, and we always stayed in the lodge. So I have very fond memories of this part of the state. And we enjoy coming back too, even now. We live in Portland, but we try to get over here as much as possible. So it's fun to be here today and to have you all present. So I think what I'll do is make a few remarks about the structure of the book, what it's about, some of the discoveries that I made, and then open it up to questions from all of you. The book really has 3 themes. One is community. The other is, of course, the changing nature of journalism over 130 some odd years, and the family that brings the 2 together, community-focused journalism. And the Aldrich, Forrester, Bedford Brown family connections have been with the paper since E.B. Aldrich was named an editor and part owner in 1980. So we have 110 years at least of that. And prior to that, the paper really started in 1875 when Matthew Bull cranked out the first issue of the East Oregonian. And after about 6 years, C.S. Sam Jackson, who would earn great fame as the editor of the Oregon Journal, edited the East Oregonian for 20 years, from roughly 1882 to 1902. Let me talk a little bit about each one of those themes and how they come together. Community is always something that I've been very interested in, and as has been mentioned, I've written a book about community formulation starting in 1875 in Longford Valley in northern Grant County. People who came across the plains on the covered wagons and set themselves up in this high mountain valley, not unlike this area, and had to figure out a way to make a living and make it their own and deal with the other people who would settle in around them. So in a sense, you can define community as a group of people who try to live in a specific location and in the process develop mutuality of values and beliefs so that they come to see themselves as a unit as opposed to others in different places, a we-they attitude. So the process of community formulation can be an easy process or a difficult one depending on the people involved. But there are really two components to it as it unfolds, and one is the face-to-face relationship that people in a given locality develop, and the other is the written communication. And the important part about the written communication for our purposes is the newspaper can provide that role. It can be the written way in which people develop the shared sense of values and beliefs. And a good example from the early days of Hamilton that kind of shows the possibilities and the need to do this, and a very conscious effort that has to take place to make sure you get the right values that the community wants to convey, is taking a look at Pendleton in the early 1880s. It was a really rough cow town, and it was better known for the number of saloons and bordellos and opium dens and gambling halls than anything else. And Sam Jackson, who was a young man in his early 20s and bought his way into this paper that was the East Oregonian, decided that this really wasn't the way the community ought to define itself, or at least it ought to consider it carefully. So he wrote editorial after editorial condemning that set of values and juxtaposed that with, wouldn't you rather be known for the quality of your schools and churches and positive or value-added business enterprises? And he won that debate within the community, and over time Pendleton changed its commitment to the kinds of values that it wanted to have represented. So that's an early example of how journalism can help a community find its values and focus and then exercise them over time. And of course he didn't leave it there. He attempted to promote the success of positive resource-based activities. And of course the basic resource there was ranching and sheep herding and dryland wheat farming. And so he did everything he could to help that part of the community develop, and then spin-off enterprises like the development of a woolen mill in Pendleton to feed off of the sheep industry. So all of that is described in the early parts of the book, and the way in which the community also dealt with others, such as the Native American component of the community. And so you can learn a lot about Oregon history from using this as a case study for the kinds of community formulation that can take place. And Sam Jackson was a very dedicated, honest, fierce fighter for the little guy, and so he established these values that the newspaper should reflect, realizing all along that the success of the community would mean the success of the paper and vice versa. That they really work together. So when he decided to go to Portland to take over the then floundering Oregon Journal in 1902, he still retained ownership of the East Oregonian, and he made sure that those who would follow him and eventually buy the paper from him would be able to carry on with the same traditions and values that he felt were essential to community and to journalism. And E.B. Aldrich was a good student of those values, and immediately he took over as editor in 1908, and within the next year he was able to do two things, promote two activities that became the hallmark of Pendleton for the next 110 years. The first being the resurrection of the woolen mills, which had closed as a result of the recession in 1907 and was in danger of being closed up and sold off and disappearing. But Aldrich convinced the community that they ought to raise the money to attract a new ownership and operators of the woolen mill, which they were successfully able to do. And then within a year, there was another activity that became a hallmark of Pendleton, the establishment of the towns around them. And once again, in the editorial pages of the East Argonian, you will see the push, the drive behind that activity. So those are just early examples of the way in which the newspaper can play a key role in the activities of the community. And of course, since 1875, the newspaper business has gone through tremendous changes, and particularly at the end of the 20th century, and now in the past 20 years, the impact of the internet, the digital age, on how newspapers are published and try to survive in a new business climate. And I think the work of the Forrester family in carrying on this enterprise and not giving up in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, which has done in many other newspapers. We all know what a challenge it has been for the continuation of the printed newspaper, let alone the ability to adapt to an online presence. But I think the book shows that they've been very successful in carrying out that operation. And there are the personalities of the family members that you've had a little bit of from Rich and from Steve that make it all come alive on the printed page. So I tried to capture that too. The work of Aldrich was so successful in Pendleton that he and the other two gentlemen that owned the paper at that time decided they'd like to branch out. So in 1919, they had an opportunity to buy a newspaper in Astoria known as the Astoria Budget. And they made a success of that operation. And so in the late 20s, they decided that maybe they'd like to try that with a third newspaper. And so they bought out of bankruptcy the Twin Falls Times in Idaho. And that proved to be a bridge too far. That operation required more effort than they had anticipated. And so after a 2-year struggle, they were lucky to find somebody who was willing to buy that paper, because now we're in 1930 on the eve of the Depression. And so it was not a good time to be trying to save a struggling enterprise. So they retreated from that and focused on saving the East Argonian and the Daily Astorian during the Depression, and they were successful in that. And so by the 1970s, they decided that once again they would like to expand their news offerings, and they started buying weekly newspapers. And they were very careful to make sure that those papers were geographically focused around the daily newspapers, so that there would be synergism between the production of those papers and the kinds of audience that the papers were serving. And so the first purchase was the Blue Mountain Eagle in the late 70s, and that led to further purchases in Milton Freewater, which they sold off after a brief period of time. But then they also bought newspapers around the Daily Astorian in northwest Oregon and lower southwest Washington, and then added the Chieftain in 2000, and then after that the Hermiston Herald. So there's now quite a cluster of newspapers that are part of the EO Media Group. And the telling of that story is also in the book as well. There were exciting events that engaged the editors, particularly in the early days. In the 20s, both the daily, the Astoria Budget and the East Argonian had to do battle with the Ku Klux Klan, which were very active, and that was quite an interesting period of time in Oregon history. And so those two newspapers, as they tried to awake people to the dangers involved with believing and following and voting for candidates who represented that point of view, gets a nice airing in the book as well. So you can learn a lot about what was happening in Oregon history through the adventures of this newspapering family in carrying out community journalism. There are many other stories and examples I can give. Any questions at this point? Yes?
I can add a story, and I don't remember which family member it was in 1981 who was invited to a class that I was taking and on community relations. And we were talking about kids being in the paper, and always it seemed like they were on the sports page. And I remarked that I'd like to see my kids on the front page or somewhere else besides the sports page. Lo and behold, and that next spring, there was this big picture of my son who had gotten a scholarship.
Yes, so your voice is heard, and that's the thing. In a community where people can express their views and the paper is receptive to what it is that the audience wants to hear, they can respond to that in a way that large corporate-owned, distant outfits who are only doing a paper strictly for a profit motive would not necessarily be as responsive as to a family that lives and breathes the community that it writes for. And there were a lot of very colorful editors in the early days of East Argonian, even before Sam Jackson took it over. And they expressed their views about women's suffrage, for instance, and being in opposition to that. And the editor of the East Argonian, who was a lawyer turned editor, took on Abigail Scott Dunaway, who was traveling around Oregon speaking on behalf of women's suffrage. And they did quite a battle with each other because they each had newspaper voices that they could use to editorially pummel each other. And people were not shy about doing that. Those were not what we would call PC days. People expressing themselves very directly and forcibly. And that's the fun part of telling the story, is quoting from those editorials to show what folks were like and what they thought. Yes, Rich, and then we'll come
Oh, you talked in the book some about, we talked about the contention in politics now, but there was a time when you would have, each party would have a paper in town. And can you talk a little bit about that era where there was a strong tie between political parties and the newspapers, and kind of how that came in and went out, maybe?
Yeah, and that's very true. And Pendleton is a good example of that. The early settlers there were, by and large, from the Upper South, and they brought with them then their Southern democratic values, and they wanted a newspaper to reflect that. But after a few years, there were people that moved into Pendleton that came from northern areas, and they were largely Republican in nature, so they had to have their own paper. And until the late 1880s, we're talking about weekly or bi-weekly newspapers. The East Argonian, in about 82, I believe it was, or 81, switched over to being published twice a week. There was enough news to do that, and enough subscriptions to support it. And then in 1888, the East Argonian became daily. And at the same time, there was still this other paper called the Pendleton Tribune, which was the Republican paper. And so it made a struggle at switching over to daily status. And it battled on until until 1923. And then it gave up the ghost, and only the East Argonian was left. But in those early days, they were largely the voice of a political party on their editorial pages. Now, they all tried to very clearly make a distinction between their news and their editorial page. So the news reflected objectively, as much as they could make it so, what was going on in the community or was telling the community about the outside world. But when they got to the editorial page, the editors expressed what their feelings were. And that's replicated in virtually every larger community. Most communities at best could support only a weekly newspaper. But if you had the population base, it was possible to go to a daily. And in the early days, they were largely party supported. And then when you get into the 20s, and especially the 30s, when it was expensive and it was hard for communities, especially small and medium-sized communities, to support more than one paper. Then partisanship became less important to the papers, and often you would find, and this is the case of the East Oregonian, starting in 1950, the editor was an independent and made that point that his views were not party affiliated. So there has been definitely an evolution over time in the way in which newspapers have been associated with or attached to strong political views. Yes, you had a question.
Well, we can all picture how they used to typeset the newspapers in the old days and the
Yeah.
printing press and everything. Could you describe the process today with everything digital? How are
Well,
newspapers?
it's all by magic today. It's all electronic. And we've tried to describe that in the paper bit, but yeah, the old press was cold type for the linotype machines. Or hot type, right, yes, hot type. Literally so hot that the molten lead was formed into the letters that would be on the paper. And then it was run through a press that put the ink on the newspaper. Today it's all digital images that get transferred electronically and put on a plate and then on a press that produces the finished product. So there's very little of the old chemical or and there's been an evolutionary process. The switch from hot type to the cold process started in the 1960s. So it's been an evolution which has picked up steam after the 1990s with the added impact of the internet and the ability to transmit the news without, well, electronically, without having to do layouts and take pictures of that and then put that on a plate.
But there's still plates involved.
Yeah,
They don't
but
just
it's
print straight
all
on a computer.
electronic now. The image is transferred onto the plate.
So when did they give up proofreading?
Yeah.
Steve too, and Paul will say that, yeah, Patty, you harp on that, you harp on that all the time. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and there's,
How many mistakes that a newspaper will make? It's just, yeah, I can't stand it. I keep wanting to circle things and send it back.
I think it's actually getting better because the pagination process and the centralization, there are fewer people involved in producing the copy. So, and, well, spell check doesn't take care of everything, so you still need the individual to do the double check and make sure that the names are spelled right and that, but the process, I think, has the potential, and I'm seeing less of those problems, particularly the East Oregonian, I think, is a very clean paper, and the Daily Historian, I'm sure, is the same because the same minds and processes are behind it. And the other thing that's interesting, too, the East Oregonian Media Group has never lost its commitment to the physical paper. And they actually maintain presses in Pelton and Astoria to print the dailies and the weeklies they own and to print for other newspapers. And that's a big commitment. It's very expensive. Those are complex machines, and to find good operators for them, that's a skill that has to be maintained. And as fewer and fewer printing presses exist, there are fewer and fewer people wanting to do that. So it's a battle to retain something that we've taken for granted for so long. And I hope the book helps people realize what would be lost if you didn't have that community newspaper, both not only electronically, but in the physical form, because gathering the news and editing it and expressing opinions still takes a lot of manpower, and it's expensive if you want to have it done right and hire quality people and keep them. So we can't ever take any of it for granted. And this book shows how one family has navigated those difficult seas. Well, somebody else has a hand up. Yes?
Well, I was just remembering when she was talking about the way papers are printed digitally now. I just remember at the Chieftain, I worked there for many years, and I remember the pain we went through to transition from offset and doing, you know, to online pagination, and we'd send this pages to Pendleton, and if there was one little glitch, it would take like a half hour to send a page. And if there was one little glitch, we'd have to start all over. I remember being down at the paper at midnight, you know, trying to send pages.
And those were the early difficult days of that, because the high-speed internet hadn't materialized yet, particularly out in the hinterlands.
It was really, you know, it was kind of like magic, but it still was not an easy process.
But that was better than doing the physical layout here, putting it in a car and carrying it through the winter.
Well, we had a printing press at the Chieftain for many years, so we just
didn't have to do that.
We didn't have to do that.
But some of the other weeklies, they didn't.
Well, and there was a period of time we did, when we started printing over in Pendleton, we did do that, carry the pages over.
Yeah. And then you had to haul the newspapers back.
Well, that still happens.
Yeah.
Do you guys own the Observer also?
No.
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 Who owns the Observer?
Western
Western Communications.
It's another,
Out of Bend.
out of Bend.
Out of the Observer?
Yeah.
Today.
A competitor. Yeah.
They own the Baker paper too.
They're the ones who make mistakes and stuff.
Yeah. They're the ones who don't do it right.
So if you subscribe to the New York Times or Boston Journal locally here, it would be printed in Pendleton typically, or no, it would be printed elsewhere?
It's printed in Northern California, isn't it? The New York Times, I think.
Well, and Tacoma.
Tacoma.
Olympia. Olympia.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have regional plans.
Excuse me, where is it?
Tacoma?
Tacoma.
Or Olympia, or Northern California, but I think papers that come into Oregon are typically out of Puget Sound area.
Okay.
Right up there.
Yes.
And how do you decide where you're selling your papers? Because you could never buy the Oregonian over here, where you only get Washington
Used to.
news. Used to. But
That's a good example of the
They don't even.
corporate decision made by absentee owners.
Yeah, yeah.
They're driven by profits, and it's too expensive, they felt, to send papers anywhere outside of the Portland metro area. So they just retreated.
And they've gone downhill ever since.
Yes, that would be my take on that too. And as they pull in, then they lay off people who used to supply them news from other parts of the state. So it's just a constant shrinkage. And yet that offers opportunities for those who see a hole, a gap in the news, and that's a good example of the entrepreneurial nature of the East Oregonian Media Group. They, in conjunction with another media group out of Portland, have created a capital news bureau to gather the news that the Oregonian no longer bothers with. And so you can get more statewide news out of the EO Media Group papers or the Portland Tribune papers than you'll find available anywhere else. Because they've hired the people to go out and gather that news and make it available. Yes?
Well, my recollection is in the heyday of the big city newspapers, the profit margins were incredible. And then as they started to drop just a little bit, there became a flurry of buying and selling in the Chicago Tribune and the Times, LA Times and all that stuff. Was there just a thing where the profits were so big and that when they dropped down a little bit, that people bailed out en masse? And that was one of the problems, that some of those old Portland, Oregonian people were used to a 20%, 30% profit margin or whatever?
Well, the crunch started developing in the 1990s when online activity started to explode. And what used to be one of the important supports of profits for newspapers was the classified ads.
Right.
And they went away with eBay and all the other online, Craigslist, right, which is a huge one. And they took away a big source of newspaper income.
Right.
And then consolidation, investors started trying to combine papers as a way of cutting costs, because one press could print for several papers, or one reporter could cover for other newspapers. And it sort of snowballed inward rather than outward. And just one thing after another caused this collapse.
Is the Oregonian kind of the picture there where they had a big building and they did all that stuff and they just, boom?
Yeah, they're no longer in their big building.
Is that replicated in cities around the country?
Yeah, it's kind of a good metaphor for what happened. They stopped printing their own papers, sold off their press, let go a good half of their staff, sold their building. It's sort of the disappearing.
It's not necessarily what's going on in every other city though, Rich. I was speaking with another publisher recently out of Vancouver. He said, no one is looking at the Oregonian model as a way to do things.
Yeah.
Really a stupid move they made. Seattle Times is still a printed product. You can get it throughout Washington State, I believe. And it's true of a lot of metropolitan dailies. There's many ways to survive.
Yeah.
The Newhouse family, which frankly doesn't, and I get this from Jerry Frank, who somebody who knew the Newhouses, knows them. He said they don't give a damn about Oregon. They just didn't care, because the greatest disconnect in what they did in Portland is that Portland is, and Oregon too, but Portland is one of those literate markets in America, book reading and otherwise, most politically active, and they dumbed down the product. In every way that they could. So they never understood the market. They never really understood Oregon. Because there's always a way to survive. You have to reconfigure it. But they chose exactly the wrong path, and they turned it into a tabloid, which is a stupid move. It's stapled.
You can't find it.
You can't. It's screwy.
Yeah.
So, but it's fine with me.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
Interesting, the Newhouses bought the paper in the late 40s. And there were two, the Oregon Journal and the Oregonian, were the two leading papers in the state. And they maintained a separate identity until there was a newspaper strike in the late 50s. And that sort of undermined the Journal. And the Newhouse folks bought that paper. They printed them in the same press, but they kept separate editorial entities. But when they bought the paper, they only made a 20-year commitment to maintain the paper. So when those 20 years run out in 1980, that was the end of the Journal. And so the Newhouses have sort of undermined newspapers from the day they came to Oregon in this process, in the drive for profits, because if they're the only daily newspaper standing in the area, and in those days, ads was like reading the Meyer Frank catalog when you looked at the Oregonian. So it's been an interesting process how we've gotten to where we are today. You have a question?
I just, first of all, a comment that makes me wonder about my degree from Newhouse School and at Syracuse. I was just recalling talking about some of these technologies. I took over editorship of a little struggling magazine that we wanted to strengthen a little bit, get a good merger with it. And we had to use a linotype machine. It was very old. And you know, what a linotype does is drop these little matrices, which were each separate letter, and they squeeze together and you shoot lead into them. But this would shoot lead between the letters. So we would have to wire brush the galleys and to get these whiskers off, but not destroy the type. And then we'd run the galleries through the proof press and then paste those up and take them 90 miles away to have them photographed, you know, bring them back, put them together, and opaque them and everything. And you know, that was what it took to get this little paper out.
How, and was it a daily? Or
No, unfortunately, it was
It's a
just
weekly.
bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly, yeah, but wow, what a process. I mean, talk about manual labor.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, they had these machines called rare typers that, you know, like a typewriter, and it would do something that looked sort of like type, but it was really awful. So we just didn't use those, but it certainly evolved a great deal after that.
Yes, and very rapidly from the 60s on.
I wonder if you heard of this. I just read it this morning. It came from Willingham out of Portland. And some columnist at the Oregonian wrote a piece favorable to this right-leaning leader. There's a lot of strife going on between the anti-fascists and the right-wing people. And now the Oregonian is getting a lot of flack for printing that and saying they shouldn't have been so positive about this guy that has done some pretty horrendous things. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that or if you'd heard about that.
No, I hadn't heard about that. That's late breaking news. Yeah.
Stop the presses.
Yeah, and that's kind of the issue. Does the newspaper really have a thorough idea about how it wants to present itself and what its community is receptive, and as it presents differing points of view, how to do that in a way that doesn't favor one or the other, but informs people with the context that they can decide for themselves what they think about that. And I think that's the challenge that the Oregonian doesn't live up to anymore. Yes? Oh, right here, another.
I was kind of thinking about the same kind of thing, about the newspaper's influence in the community versus the community's influence on the newspaper. And I wonder if you might speak about that.
Well, I think it goes back to that early example I had about the interchange between how the paper tries to coalesce an idea or a value in the community, and then the kind of feedback it gets because there are those letters to the editor that respond to what the editor has to say, or public officials who take to heart what's noted in the newspaper. There's an example in the East Oregonian in the late 1880s. The courthouse by then had become quite ramshackle. It was over 20 years old. It was a wooden structure that had been thrown up very quickly. And the court sessions were held there, and it would often bring too many people into the building, and it was a question of whether it could withstand that, and was it time for the community to raise the taxes to build a new courthouse? Well, nobody wanted to do that, because, you know, let's keep going until something happens. Well, there was a big flood that came through and took out the Main Street Bridge at that time, and was lucky that nobody was on it. So the editor, Sam Jackson, wrote an editorial saying, Do we want the same thing to happen? We have the same potential of a disaster in this courthouse that could have happened on the bridge. And so maybe it's time to think about a new courthouse. And the community responded and raised the taxes and built a new courthouse. So it took somebody stepping up to the plate, in this case the newspaper. That's kind of the dance that goes on, I think, between the community and the newspaper. Other questions? Yes?
I read a couple of years ago that rural and small community newspapers are actually healthier than the big city newspapers because whereby their subscriptions and readerships have shrunken dramatically in rural communities. They depend more on their local newspaper to understand what's going on. And therefore, they might be more healthy even for penetration statistics and revenue than their larger counterparts. Can you comment on that? Is that still the case, or was that never the case?
Well, yeah, I'll let you do that.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts and I'll
Yeah,
add to
there's
what
truth to what you read and observed and think. One of the reasons is, if you're the Oregonian, for instance, before Newhouses totally botched it, are you Multnomah County's paper? Are you Portland's paper? Are you Clackamas County's paper? Are you Multnomah County's paper? Are you Washington County's paper? Or are you Oregon's paper? And so in terms of what your focus is, it gets very muddled, and if you're not very clear about it, you try to do too many things or not enough and that sort of thing. If you're Wallowa County's paper, it's pretty clear what you're doing. If you're Clatsop County's paper in Astoria, it's pretty clear. You wash over a little bit of the Washington side of the river, but that if you're Pendleton and so forth. So it's easier for us to define ourselves in our markets. Even the Capital Press, if some of you here, I'm sure, read the Capital Press, Agriculture Weekly out of Salem, circulates in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California. It's all about food and livestock and water. And so that's sort of the trinity, I guess you'd say, of what that paper is. And that's what the readership wants to know about, and so on and so forth. The other thing, just to circle back on the mistakes made of the Oregonian, I think Bill was commenting, or Rich was commenting on the profit margin changing. The thing about the Oregonian that very few people realize is that S.I. Newhouse, who bought it, was a genius. There are many stories about how he could size up a property, know just what to offer, how to play the tax game just right, and that's how he had the largest or second largest chain in America for a while. And but he was not a journalist, and in that he was not like the Sulzbergers who have the New York Times. We've had the New York Times since the 1800s, and they're both out of New York City, and they both have considerable newspaper holdings. But with the Sulzbergers and the New York Times, there's always been an eye to what are we doing here as a newspaper publisher. With Newhouse, it was all about the money. Now, having said that, they were going to give you things in its day, of course, but you get to the time when everything's running against you as a metropolitan paper, and they don't know what to do because they really don't, that part of the game is not in their DNA, the next generation down and everything. Meanwhile, the current generation of Sulzbergers are now going to run the New York Times.
Yeah, there's a family continuation there.
But the initial point you made is true, that maintaining a paper in Wallowa County, to say anything's easier is kind of silly these days, about anything in the world. But it's a more well-defined, it's easier to define what you're doing there.
And I guess the other struggle is to keep reminding people of the value of the physical presence of the paper. If people just get their news online, it's ephemeral. They don't realize all of the work that goes into making it possible to have that news online. And so the trick is, how do you monetize people who are only looking at it online and not buying physical products? So it's finding the right balance of economics in that regard, and reminding people that there is value added by having a community-based paper. Yeah.
How does the present distrust of the media affect our small newspapers?
It doesn't make it easier, that's for sure. Yeah, well, it ought to be a challenge to all of us to think about what is news, what is fake, what is truth, how do we determine those things? It all ought to make us harder and not just take somebody's word for what they think it is, but to decide for ourselves what we value in the way of information and how we ought to process it. Sweeping statements, particularly when they're directed at magnifying one particular point of view as opposed to considering what the range of possibilities might be, ought to be suspicious to everyone. And indicate all the more why we need as many possible sources as possible for understanding the issues that we're dealing with today, and not just relying on someone to speak from on high and say this is truth and this is fake. Yes?
So I'd kind of like to pick up on that and direct it to Paul. It seems to me that in Willow County, you might get disagreements about a particular issue. Should we build this clinic, or should we invest in, should this school bond pass, or whatever. And there you get different points of view, but they're fairly rational. When it comes to the different points of view on outside politics, they're fairly irrational. Is that your experience, Paul?
Yeah, I would say, if you're going to generalize, that's definitely the case. I think the hardest part about being in journalism now, and this is my 37th year of doing this, so I have some background to kind of compare it to. This is the hardest time I've ever had in journalism because there are so many people out there who are willing to say, I'm terrible, bad, stupid, unintelligent, you fill in the blanks, who have never met me, who have never ever come to my office and said, hey, can I talk to you about something? That's probably what makes it harder than it's ever been, is because there is this standard of mistrust, is what I call it, that is kind of seeping into everything. And basically, anybody who comes to see me and says, hey, I have a disagreement, I offer them a letter or I guess column, or I say, we'll address that in another story. But if you don't ever come and find out what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it, and you just sit out there and shoot from the weeds, that makes it difficult for everybody. And Facebook is the biggest culprit in that.
For those of you who don't know this, Paul Wall is the editor of the Chieftain.
I'll append what Paul said. There was one of my critics in that story was a guy, I knew his name, and he would sign his emails, which was more than often what you get these days. And I would reach out to him and say, why don't we visit face to face?
Yeah.
And he always had a reason why he couldn't do that. And it was quite clear he did not want to have a face-to-face conversation.
Or their response will be, oh, I hear you're a terrible person from so-and-so.
No, it was none of that. It was just,
I get that one.
He did not want to have face-to-face. And that's the malady we live with these days, is people who want to hide behind, either it's an anonymous name online, or just not appear and not engage in what we would call civil discourse.
Yeah, social media has given everyone their own personal megaphone, and they can blast out what they think, and then they're on to the next thing. They don't want to engage, like Steve said, in a back and forth about the issue, or maybe see if their view might need to be amended or changed.
Or just take the simple responsibility of putting your name on.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
That's
Yeah. Go ahead.
You practically have to sign your whole library to get a letter to the editor. Your name, your address, your
well,
census.
that's because we've been tricked.
Right.
We've been tricked. That's why you have to do that.
Uh-huh.
In Astoria, one of the celebrated moments of that was it was a complicated marriage situation. There'd been two wives. You see where this is going? one wife signs the name to this letter, and everybody thinks it's the other wife, and so forth. And then other people who would sign other people's names to the letters. So that's why we demand an address and sometimes a phone number too. In Astoria, and I'm sure you're doing it here, we confirmed each letter, because we've been had before.
Well, the chieftain used to have pseudonyms, they used to let people put,
Climate structure.
yeah, claim structure.
Yeah, lots of papers did. My father did in Pendleton. He would run a name with the letters. Won't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Times change.
Well, I understand, I'm just joking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's a real reason.
Don's too shy, but I would like for him to tell an experience he had with the bond issues.
Oh, okay. It's back when the schools were toying with the ideas of getting together in one school instead of 3 high schools and things like that. We had a meeting at the courthouse. Every seat in the courthouse was taken, and most of the standing room was taken. And I went to that, and I had a tape recorder. And I was considered the leader of one section, and a friend of mine was the leader of the opposition. Well, he got up and made a long speech, this friend of mine. And I got it all on tape, and I went back to the chieftain and I wrote the story. And all I had to do was type it off of the tape recorder. And I knew that the next morning he would be in to question what I had done. So he came in and he said, Don, you didn't represent me very fairly there. And I said, well, Mac, what happened? He said, well, and I turned on the tape recorder and handed him a paper. I said, Mac, read this column. And it was word for word what he had said. And when he got done, he said, well, you wrote what I said, but you didn't write what I meant.
That's
We're almost running out of time. I got, Dick, my friend up there, was talking about payment in journalism now. It used to be people went to journalism schools, they got, they got into the profession, and now the internships are fewer and they're not paid as often. And with the social media, it extends into the book publishing business too. But you essentially become your own journalist, and the payment is less to journalists or to contributors. He was saying that some of the op-eds in the New York Times are not paid for now.
Rich, I have to correct you on one thing. Internships in Oregon are plentiful. A wonderful program out of the University of Oregon is called the Snowden Internship Program, founded by the Snowden family. He was a guy in the Oregon Journal.
Okay.
And Snowden pays half of the salary of the intern. These are not free interns. Half the salary, the newspaper pays the other half.
Okay.
And I don't think the chieftains ever, most of our weeklies have not had one of these, but at Pendleton, Astoria, Salem, and one of our weeklies, we've used these interns. But they come, they're in Oregon schools, public and private, and they're all very bright, and we've then hired many of them. So it's just, there's different ways of entering business these days, but in Oregon, at least, I can't speak for any other state, but we have this marvelous internship program that is all paid for.
But J School enrollment is down, isn't it?
No.
No?
What's different about J School is that it's not the J School your grandfather went to or your father went to. They're talking about digital things, they're talking about video, they're talking about audio, and they're talking about all the different ways of storytelling. They still do, I guess, reporting classes. How would I know? I haven't checked in on one of these places in a long time. But they're still around and doing well. I think U of O is thriving. WSU has one, the Burroughs School of Journalism, and UW has a program. It depends a whole lot on the teacher. For years, a guy named Russell Sadler ran the program in Southern Oregon, and we got great reporters out of that program, hired them. Floyd McKay, then former KGW guy in Portland, you might remember him. He went to Western Washington and ran a program there. He turned out great graduates, and we hired them. So it's like everything else, it's all in who the teacher is, who inspires a student and sets them on their course. And that's what you're looking for, is a young person who has that in them. And they come in all sort of backgrounds. One of our most impressive interns, and she's now one of our best reporters at the Astorian, Katie Frankowitz, I complimented her when she was an intern with us because she'd done a great job on this high school reunion story. She'd really brought it to life, and I said, so what high school did you go to? I didn't, she said. Oh, she did independent study at home. And then after that went to the University of Oregon. She never went to high school, which is one I hadn't really run into. And it was at that point I realized, okay, these are all coming in different packages now than they used to. So that's what you have to be willing to, accept and give it a try.
I think the larger point also that maybe you're making, Rich, is that the word seems to be out there that the newspapers and journalism is in troubled times and may not have a future, and therefore bright, capable people won't go to journalism school. There won't be enough reporters in the future. I think that might be dangerous. The false image that just a broad brush of journalism everywhere is collapsing because some papers are closing and they're cutting back. Therefore, why would I go into that profession if there's not going to be a job when I get through? So we want to do what Steve is saying, advertise the fact that it is a still thriving enterprise and that it's a good place for bright young people to go to.
But the other thing in Phil's book is my grandfather, Alder E.B. Aldrich, was a graduate of Oregon Agriculture College. His degree was in agriculture. He worked in the barns at Oregon State, where he learned you are what you eat. My mother always told me that. I think, did he work on the barometer?
No, I don't think he did.
Yeah.
No.
So he was not a journalism school grad, but C.S. Jackson was his teacher.
Yeah.
Neither are you.
And I guess the reason why he was sort of inclined is that his father had started a newspaper in Newport.
Yeah.
And so he had some inclination of journalism.
Yeah.
And after he got out of college, I think he was struggling to find a job, and there was this opening over in Hamilton, and he got hired, and it took off. He found his calling. Yes.
Well, I appreciate the encouraging words about employment in journalism, but if I'm not mistaken, I think the statistics are greatly against you. I believe that there are less than half of the journalism jobs in America as there were 20 years ago, or even or less than that, which does go back to Rich's question that, it's nice that, I'm actually surprised journalism schools, as many of them still exist, or I haven't heard that their populations have gone way down, and it's, people love journalism, working in it because there are other things besides remuneration that we work for. But if you're just talking about jobs, numbers of jobs, the salary for jobs, I mean, I even saw a statistic on like the best and worst jobs in America. Journalism was up at the top in the 1980s, and it's near the bottom now. I mean, it's down there with like loggers and.
That's actually what it is one guy. That's coming out. But just I got to tell you that Ed, the journalism represented in this room, Ed's got a journalism background. My friend Dick was with the Seattle Times for a long time, and Rob Kemp that just talked was with U.S. News and the Seattle Times, right? Before that, and John was several newspapers and taught journalism at Mankato State. And we got Paul back here. And don't forget Ann Hayes, whose grandfather, you guys didn't know this, was Robert Sawyer.
Oh.
The publisher of the of the Bend newspaper.
Yeah, very famous.
Okay, a very famous guy.
Well, and Jamie.
And Don Swart, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
My gosh, in Joseph, Oregon, all of this journalism.
Yeah.
Point in time here.
There's a lot.
I'd just like to say one thing. Did you remember Virgil Rupp?
No.
Well, Virgil Rupp, I didn't even go to college. I graduated from high school. I was a rancher. And Virgil Rupp was with the East Oregonian. And Advertimes was a free paper that went in all the rural mailboxes. Free, because he started it up because he left and had his own newspaper. So when the second issue came out, it was all positive and it was about agriculture. Well, I didn't go to college, but I know about cows and stuff. And so I wrote a little article and he said, "You're hired." And he was my journalism teacher. I wrote Jamie's Journal for 31 years. And I think Barry is a cowboy and he is now a columnist. Did you go to journalism school? No. What I'm saying
It's amazing.
Janie's Journal Janie's Journal might be the longest running newspaper column of any of us in the room.
Anyway, you don't have to go to journalism school.
No, you're absolutely right.
And 75 cents a column inch. Money to me.
Oh.
It was better than my eggs money.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting going through the records. The EO was paying the local correspondents from the various small towns in Umatilla and Morrow County and northern Grant County. The reach of East Oregonian went down as far as Longford. Correspondent from there, and they're like $1.50 a week and $2.50 here and there. It's all listed, and they all got paid their small sums for their.
Well, the Inaha column isn't in anymore, but people used to move from here. You know, I've been here 50 years, but people would move away from this beautiful place, and they got the chieftain, you know why? To read about Inaha. That's the truth.
They wanted to get the latest rattlesnake count.
So, Bill, thank you very much, and Steve for coming out.
Supposed to print this out. He doesn't know how to be a power.
The book is still free publication, I think.
No. Wait a minute.
Oh, Cheryl said it wasn't available till November on English.